Voting is generally pretty easy, but it's not for everybody. This is due to voter ID laws that have been implemented in the past few years. However, there is an important purpose behind these laws. In a recent New York Times editorial, voter ID laws passed in Texas were brought into light. It was made very clear through the editorial that many believe that these laws will have a very negative impact. I will provide reasons why I believe the New York Times editorial did not provide strong enough evidence in order to support the following claims. 1. Elected officials do not have the evidence to prove the existence of voter fraud, therefore, voter fraud does not exist. 2. Voter fraud is virtually non-existent, therefore it's not an issue. And 3. Voter ID laws are mandated as a form of voter suppression. The first claim in the editorial was that lawmakers who insist voter laws are necessary have not bothered to come up with any evidence that voter fraud does exist. All because lawmakers have not provided evidence of voter fraud existing does not mean that voter fraud does not occur. The editorial did not accurately provide evidence to prove that voter fraud does not exist. I refute the first subclaim made by the editorial by providing evidence of an example of voter fraud. In a Kansas City primary against Will Royster, John J. Rizzo won by a single vote. Suspicious conduct. In a Kansas City primary race against Will Royster, John J. Rizzo won by a single vote. Suspicious conduct on the account of Rizzo was reported, but there was not proper evidence at the time of the trial in order to convict him of voter fraud. Election judges later came up with evidence to support the claim that Rizzo had hired a bunch of Somali that Rizzo had hired Somalians to post. Election judges later provided evidence that Rizzo had hired a bunch of Somali. Election judges later provided evidence that Rizzo had a group of Somalians cast ballots at the polls, regardless of the fact that they were non-English speaking and were not eligible to vote. Several supporters outside of the 40th district in which Rizzo was running several supporters outside of the 40th district in which Rizzo was running also casted ballots despite their home addresses residing outside of the 40th district. Lastly, a total of 14 ballots were counted that were not signed by election officials. The Rizzo and Royster case is a strong example of voter fraud. Using the claim that voter fraud does not exist since there hasn't been any evidence provided is not strong enough. All because you don't see something does not mean that it does not exist. An additional claim made by the editorial is that voter fraud ID virtually does not exist, therefore it is not an issue. The editorial provided expert testimonies from former officials whom have stated that voter ID fraud does not occur often. However, although voter fraud rarely occurs, it still does occur. And the percentage in which voter fraud occurs is irrelevant to the issue. What is important is that voter fraud does happen, no matter how rare of an occurrence that may be. I refute the claim that voter fraud virtually does not exist by presenting additional evidence of voter fraud. In 2014, North Carolina state election officials investigated thousands of cases of potential voter fraud. Kim Strack, the elections director to the Joint Legislative Elections Oversight Committee, reported that about 81 votes were casted in the ballots of the 2012 general election under names of Kim Strack, the elections director of the committee. Kim Strack, the elections director of the committee, reported that about 81 votes were casted in the ballots of the 2012 general election under the names of individuals who were reported as deceased. The audit further identified 13,416 deceased voters on voter rolls in the October of 2000. The audit further identified 13,416 deceased voters on voter rolls in October of 2013. The audit also included 155,692 registered North Carolina voters whose identification information matches those of voters in other states. Voter fraud is occurring, whether it's people taking the names of the deceased or people who are voting multiple times in different states. Although the number of voter fraud cases is significantly small, it's important that officials take action to avoid potential fraud from occurring. To not act accordingly in response to voter fraud occurrences, regardless of how rare they are, would be to accept an infringement on the democratic process of free and fair elections. Lastly, the editorial made the claim that voter ID laws are intended to suppress voters instead of prevent voter fraud. Evidence used in support of the editorial's third claim was an expert testimony given by federal judge Richard Posner. He was quoted as saying, that voter ID laws are now widely regarded as a means of voter suppression rather than fraud prevention. The evidence was not sufficient enough in supporting the claim that voter ID laws are suppressing people. The evidence was not sufficient enough in supporting the claim that voter ID laws suppress voters. Better support of the claim would be providing statistical evidence of suppression caused by voter ID laws. I have provided statistical evidence in order to prove that I went ahead and provided statistical evidence. I went ahead and provided statistical evidence as an example of what the article should have used in order to support their claim. The U.S. Government Accountability Office in a report by the U.S. Accountability Office, there is significant evidence to support the claim that voter ID laws do suppress eligible voters. The GAO found that many states require a government-issued ID. Many of those IDs cost from about $16 to up to $60, and a lot of people can't afford that. Studies of cases were found that show a decrease in voter turnout occurred because of the ID requirements at the polls. Turnout was found also to be reduced in people ages from 18 to 23, as opposed to the ages of 44 to 53. A lot of that could probably be attributed to 18-year-olds not being able to afford to buy an ID. The number of African American voters was also reported to have decreased as well as a result of the ID laws. The expert testimony provided to support the claim by the editorial was not specific or strong enough to provide evidence of voter suppression due to voter ID laws. In conclusion, the New York Times editorial discussing voter ID laws. In conclusion, the New York Times editorial discussing voter ID laws in Texas. In conclusion, the New York Times editorial did not provide strong enough evidence in order to support their claims. The editorial did not provide evidence, whether that be statistical or a specific example. The editorial did not provide evidence. The editorial did not provide evidence to support the claim that voter fraud does not exist. The claim that a lack of evidence provided by officials must mean evidence of voter fraud does not exist is too weak of an argument. The claim that voter fraud is so rare that it's not an issue is not strong enough at all either. It doesn't matter how rarely voter fraud occurs. The claim that voter fraud is so rare that it is not an issue is too weak as well. The claim that voter fraud is so rare that it's not an issue is also too weak. No matter how rarely it does occur, to ignore that it does occur is to completely disregard the people's right to receive elected officials through fair and free elections. To ignore the fact that voter fraud does occur is to completely disregard the people's right to receive elected officials through free and fair elections. To ignore the fact that voter fraud does occur is to completely disregard the fact that voter fraud does occur is to completely disregard the people's right to receive elected officials through free. To ignore the fact that voter fraud does occur is to completely disregard the people's right to receive elected officials through free and fair elections. And finally, the editorial claims that voter ID laws are used as a form of voter suppression, but lacked. And finally, the editorial claimed that voter ID laws are used as a form of voter suppression, but they did not provide any statistical evidence. And finally, the editorial claimed that voter ID laws are used as a form of voter suppression, but they lacked. And finally, the editorial claimed that voter ID laws are used as a form of voter suppression, but lacked in providing any statistical evidence or first-person examples of voter suppression to support the claim. In closing, I will say that the New York Times editorial did not provide strong enough evidence in support of their claims. The large use of expert testimonies in support of the claims was not specific enough. The use of expert testimonies in support of the article's claims was not specific enough or backed up by enough statistical evidence in order for it to be strong. The use of expert testimonies in support of the claims was not strong enough. The use of expert testimonies in support of the claims was not specific enough. The use of expert testimonies in support of the claims was not specific enough or backed up by statistical evidence. It takes much more than a personal opinion to prove a claim to be fact. Thank you for listening.